Good afternoon. Welcome to APA's 8th Town Hall on COVID-19. My name is Billy Zydik, APA Standards and Codes Administrator. Allow me to review a couple of housekeeping items before we start. All attendees are in listen-only mode. We ask that you utilize the chat box for the Q&A segment of this session. While we attempt to respond to all questions submitted, should we run out of time, responses will be posted to APA's COVID-19 RAQ, Recently Asked Questions, webpage. We also remind participants to ensure their own speaker volume levels are set to your comfort. Our speakers are gathering us from across the continent, and as such, varying volumes will be present. Today's session will award professional continuing education credits such as ISDs and AIA CLUs and PDHs. For AIA certificates, please email me at Billie, B-I-L-L-I-E, at APA.org, along with your AIA membership number. Our webinar recordings will be posted to APA's website later this afternoon. Additionally, you will receive a follow-up email within 72 hours providing designated links to all webinar recordings, as well as information on upcoming webinars and town halls. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Lander Medlin, APA's Executive Vice President, your moderator for today. Lander, take it away.
Welcome, everyone. We appreciate your engagement in these town hall meetings as we further explore the impact of COVID-19 on our facilities organizations and the education enterprise. I'd like to thank both our regular participants, I see many of you each week, and any new folks who decided to join us today. We really appreciate it. As you know, our prior town halls have been recorded along with answers to all your questions and posted to the APA COVID-19 website resource center. It is constantly being updated, so please return regularly. Our town hall meetings do occur every Friday at this time with a different target and focus. Hint, next week's is called Preparing Now for the Student of 2024. Again, thank you for joining the dialogue. We really want your questions. That's what makes this a rich conversation and the special community we share. So post them at any time. I have recounted over the past couple of weeks that the next unimaginable nightmare lurks around the corner. The impact of the larger economies are roiling higher education. Frankly, the challenges are tearing at the very fabric of our institutions, and they are upon us as we stare down the barrel of a fall reopening, whatever that means. That's why we chose this topic today, the first in a series of the impact of COVID-19, if, then, what scenarios. The three panelists today will help us kick into high gear on the planning needed to drive, support, and lead institutional decision-making for a successful fall reopening in whatever form that takes. So here's the format for today's town hall. I'll provide an introduction to set the context, set the stage for this changing playing field we call scenario planning, introduce our stellar panel, who will provide some opening or framing remarks, and then we'll get right to the Q&A, as I know you've got many questions to ask this exceptional panel. I'll conclude with an update on our survey, call for images, available resources, save the date, and closing remarks. I've opened each town hall with a compare and contrast of the coronavirus statistics. Yesterday, Thursday, May 7, 2020, the U.S. recorded over 1.2 million cases, closing in on 76,000 deaths. As a matter of fact, there were 2,112 deaths just yesterday alone. Put in perspective, 9 weeks ago, there were only 12 deaths. And with states reopening, the new modeling estimate out of the University of Washington is projecting 134,000 deaths. Everyone wishes, I wish we were looking at the backside of this pandemic curve. Sadly, we are not. This pandemic is the worst we've seen in 100 years. In fact, 44 states are in varying stages of reopening as of this weekend. No state has met the federal guidelines for reopening. Yet, across all states, 34 states, the cases are rising, but in 16 states, the cases are falling. All would agree we need aggressive testing, contact tracing, treatment, and of course, needed vaccine. You'll see that some of our institutions are preparing to do just that, test and trace, to hedge the impact on their own communities and further protect them. Suffice it to say, complacency with respect to social, physical distancing is not an option. That will take individuals' commitment to those behaviors. We know that works. Use your head, stop the spread. The impact on the economy remains tumultuous. Yesterday, we crested 33.5 million people. Another 3.2 million applied for unemployment benefits. That's 14.7% of the U.S. workforce. This eased with the peak the last couple of weeks, but marks the 7th week the coronavirus triggered record applications. Another distressing fact is the hunger crisis. In fact, more than 17% of young children lack sufficient food, a rate 3 times higher than during the worst of the Great Recession. These days, it is anything but business as usual. This will require perseverance, strength, and resilience, all qualities I find in our can-do problem-solving facilities professionals. Yet we must first focus on problem planning. General Dwight D. Eisenhower said, "Planning is everything, but plans are nothing." Meaning planning is the preparation to respond to the unknowable. Boy, do we have a lot of unknowns. Whether your institution chooses to close, stay online, slow transition, hybrid approach, full reopen, you need to prepare now for how facilities can and will respond. Do we even know what the questions are? And there's no one-size-fits-all solution. In the context of if, then, what scenarios, we must recognize that hope is not a strategy and denial is not a plan. Hence our panel today, each speaking to this changed world, the level of uncertainty, and providing perspectives on its complexity. As we will see, the road to reopening and recovery takes many planning paths. Let's start first with Dwayne Hickling, the managing principal at Hickling and Associates LLC. Dwayne has more than 20 years of experience in aligning and executing organizational goals and objectives for higher education institutions, with a passion for advancing the field of facilities management through data and technology, along with many other critically relevant areas of expertise. Formerly, Dwayne held positions of Associate Vice President at the University of Chicago and Assistant Vice Chancellor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Interestingly, at the University of Southern California, he was the Executive Olympics Administrator for the 1984 Olympic Games before moving into a facilities operations role as Executive Director of Facilities Operations and Maintenance Services. Today, Dwayne will frame the COVID-19 response against prior national crises, discuss the need for adaptation, collective creativity and innovation, and the behavioral modifications for protected populations. Dwayne?
Thank you, Lander. In early March, in that 9-week time frame, 9-week ago time frame that Lander pointed out, I described the COVID-19 events that we were looking at that time is that this could likely be a very slow-moving 9/11 type crisis. It would likely have an impact on our country similar to 9/11, potentially impact psychologically as much as 9/11. But the difficulty in terms of a 9/11 type crisis, a slow-moving 9/11 type crisis, is that it's harder to recognize. It's harder for people to grasp that it's really happening. In 9/11, it was violent, it was short, it was abrupt, and it all happened within an hour to 90 minutes, and we all could recognize that the world has changed. when something is slow moving and creeping, it's much harder to recognize that the world is changing. It's much harder for us to make very quick decisions or definitive decisions. There's a lot more time to debate once what could be happening. But coming out of 9/11, we were able to get ourselves back into business with some adaptation. And some of that adaptation was very, very quick. Some of that adaptation took a little longer. To make air travel safe again, we adopted screening techniques that were much more rigorous than had been addressed before. We created a safe environment inside airports. Air travel became a safe environment. There were no weapons. There were no bombs, supposedly no bomb-making materials in that environment. And we could travel from one airport to another as long as we stayed inside the air travel system. We were in a protected environment. Once we went outside that system, we would have to be rescreened to get back into that environment. So a lot of changes were made, and then we accepted those changes and we moved on. Going to the next slide, this enemy that we face is much more difficult. It's invisible. It infiltrates our communities and neighborhoods in a quiet way. We can't recognize right away that it is even there as it starts to infect the population. So as we create a community on campus, opening up our campuses again, how are we going to address this effectively? One of the things that we're going to need is a lot of data. Edward Deming once said that without data, you're just another individual with an opinion. Trying to make decisions on unsubstantiated opinions that is very difficult and takes a lot of discussion. With data, we can understand the environment that we're working in, and we can help create a protected population for our communities to work with. And the communities I'm talking about here are our college campuses. And we are going to need to recognize that we are going to have to change our social behaviors to keep these protected populations and environments safe. This might be a good year for an institution to be a rural liberal arts school where it's easy to create a protected environment, where it's easy to be able to put a residential population in place once it's tested and proven to be capable of uninfected. Then it's a lot easier for that population to then interact. However, it may be more difficult for us to continue to allow the behavior of on and off campus travel, weekend travel away from home, or away from the campus, back and forth, going to social events, that sort of thing. We're still trying to figure out exactly what that allowing effort is. Going to this next slide, there's several things that we're going to need to address to make sure that we start with an appropriate population and try to keep our environment safe. The first is, it seems to me that the testing is most important because this creates the data. It tells us if an individual has been infected, if an individual is carrying the virus, and it allows us to identify where the virus is and whether our environment that we're working in is safe, is clean, and the population is such that we can protect it. Or if an individual needs to quarantine. Testing is still difficult. It is being debated often in the medical and news circles. One of the most encouraging reports that I saw recently was the University of Arizona president was on a recent news program and indicated that their institution is developed their own test, and they feel a great deal of confidence in it. And so their plan is to test the entire student body, returning faculty and staff, to try to identify exactly what their campus will be able to do in terms of creating that safe environment and protected population. This next point of possible travel restrictions. I often hear people say, well, we can't control where the students go. We can't control what they do. What's very interesting is coming out of 9/11, we did impose some controls on what we did. We did adjust our behavior. And in the interest of a community, to maintain the community being safe, we may need to be able to impose some controls. It may not be unrealistic. Well, we live in this limbo between infection of a virus that we can only combat right now by playing defense until a vaccine is discovered or created. We may have to adopt travel restrictions or behavior restrictions that we would otherwise find unreasonable or untenable. Another point that is very interesting, and it seems like every week there comes out with stories of a new technology for contact monitoring, to be able to understand, have I been exposed to the virus? Have I been in contact with anyone or populations that have been exposed to the virus? Am I in a safe population? That sort of contact monitoring and tracking with the apps may be something that will be in our lives. Right now, Google already tracks often where we go. As creepy as that is, I get a report at the end of every month that Google says, okay, these are the places that you've been this last month. and I wonder who else is reading my Google report. Quarantine is obviously when necessary, and making sure that if we suspect that we're infected or suspect that we may be a carrier, quarantining for a certain amount of time may be something that our campuses will have to accept and provide for. Personal protective equipment. I know in many parts of the country, it's now mandatory. You go to certain locations, grocery stores, whatever, you're not going to be able to get in without wearing a mask. It's also been a little distressing in some parts of the country, the conflicts that arise when people feel that, well, it's my personal right to not wear a mask. But on our campuses, we may need to impose a certain level of personal protective equipment if we're not able to secure the entire campus as a protected location. The difficulty about this particular crisis is it started out as a health crisis. It's rapidly, of course, turned into a financial crisis for our institutions, and then it becomes a liability crisis as businesses and institutions start trying to consider getting back into work, getting back into business. It's very easy for an institution to talk about allowing a student to take a gap year. It gets much more difficult when the institution is faced with the possibility of taking a gap year. One of the things that may be very interesting is to allow our institutions to adapt to the mood of our students. Some students that may have been attending an institution that required a long distance travel to get to may not want to take that travel risk to get there. Maybe they prefer to take a semester or a year in an institution closer to home, where there's less risk by having to travel. Some students may find that they're more comfortable going to an institution where they can be a resident on campus and stay on campus in a more a less urban setting. Other institutions may find that due to their particular circumstances, they don't have the financial wherewithal to go to the campus where they would normally been attending, and so maybe they're going to try to pick up credits at their local junior college, doing appropriate social distancing. Back in the Katrina crisis, higher education linked itself together, and students from affected institutions in New Orleans were able to go to other institutions and continue their studies. Is that an agreement or possible in the current higher education environment? Will students have the flexibility to make some decisions in terms of where they go back to school? So going to this last slide, one of the things that's very powerful in higher education is that we do have a lot of very smart and talented people that are capable of solving very complex problems, and they do it very well. The challenge that we have in higher education is we often revert to tradition, and our decision-making processes sometimes can be long and difficult. It's very easy for us to form a committee, debate how a response may be appropriate or not appropriate, and all the pros and cons. As the calendar continues to click toward the opening times of our fall semesters and quarters, the time for debate grows shorter, and we need to be able to make some decisions. These decisions are going to be challenging. There's going to be a certain amount of risk. We're going to have to figure out what social behaviors are going to be acceptable. We're going to have to be able to communicate those social behaviors to our community that we try to bring back on campus. And it's going to be an education process in providing that is beyond some of the education that we normally think that we can that we deliver. But I do believe that there are solutions out there. I do believe that with creativity that we can manage both the financial difficulty that institutions have, as well as the liability issues that are going to be faced. It is going to take flexibility, and there's not going to be a one-size-all that fits every solution, as Lander pointed out. So at that point, I'm going to turn it over to my other panelists. As a consultant, it's easy for me to give advice on these things. My colleagues on the panelists, they are the people making decisions. I'm sure they'll be able to give you the answers to the challenges we face.
Well, that's always a setup, Dwayne. Lob that ball nicely. I've always heard you, Dwayne, say, "In God we trust, all others bring data." Many of us have heard that saying, and data is going to be important as we approach these challenging decisions, the liability and risks, or the risk and liability associated with, especially since we're not just dealing with an entity, a built environment structure, or even a perimeter setting, but individuals' behavior. So the balancing act portion you spoke about is really critical. Our ability to be way more flexible than ever and adaptable will be so important. So thank you, Dwayne. I'm going to now move to Lynn Finn. Lynn is the Associate Vice President of Facilities Management, University of Iowa. Lynn has spent 30 years in facilities management with increasing levels of responsibility. She suggests it's now really 33 years because, like dog years, there should be COVID years where you had 3 years for the last 3 months. I can certainly identify Lynn, always the jokester, and I love it. I've known Lynn since she joined the faculty of APA's Institute for facilities management, where she now serves in the role of provost and faculty member of the Institute. Lynn will seek to validate the human impact of all this uncertainty, discuss the myriad "if this happens, then that will happen" framework concerning the virus, safety and science, financial and resource conditions, and take us through a web-like matrix of how scenarios might flow. Lynn?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Lander. Happy to be here with all of you today. You know, people ask me, how are you? And I think I usually say, I'm okay. But I think really our answer is we're everything, right? We are overwhelmed but grateful. We are overwhelmed by the change and the uncertainty, but we are so grateful for all the good things that are happening, the good work that people are doing. We are exhausted but energized. We are exhausted with the nature of life right now, but we are energized by the ability and the opportunity to learn every day, and quite honestly, the adrenaline. And then finally, I find myself saying I am feeling very isolated, as it is with many of us these days, but I'm also very connected. I am reminded daily of relationships and being connected with team members in a way that I haven't been before, and then that ability to reach out to my colleagues across the nation and compare notes and commiserate and come up with ideas. So many of us are in a situation of making decisions and leading, but with this very unsettling atmosphere. And I think a lot of that is coming from this perpetual planning cycle that we seem to be in. And so when we think about if then what, as Lander has got us set up here, we're problem solvers, right? In facilities management. This is just a problem. It's a conditional statement. We have a hypothesis and a conclusion. This can't be that hard. As Dwayne talked about, we're problem solvers. We're good problem solvers in higher education. But unfortunately, the middle statement is probably a better acknowledgement of where we are. If this happens, then that, and that will happen. And quite honestly, if we are looking at it realistically, it's probably like the last sentence there. If this, and this happens, then that will happen. So we're back to those words that we're finding that we use every day over and over. We are dealing with the unknown. We are dealing with uncertainty, and we are in unprecedented times. The next slide gives you another way of thinking about the complications that we're dealing with right now. So it's not just one conditional statement with multiple variables on both sides, but the questions and the statement is changing under our feet, literally. So we go down a decision path and all of a sudden there is new information or a new perspective, a new interpretation, and we're off in another direction. So facilities management is built on people who are doers. And so when we go to if then what, we've got to get to an action place. There's a couple of things that I think are barriers for us in this endeavor. We thrive in a proactive environment, but here and now it feels like we can't prepare. We are only planning. Another factor that I think gets in our way right now is that we hear the phrase the new normal. Will the change be permanent? Dwayne talked about some of the permanent adaptations that have happened in our world after 9/11, specifically related to air travel and security. Well, facilities management folks, we believe in stewardship, total cost of ownership, and long-term decisions. But we don't have any of that right now. We don't know if the changes we're making will be permanent. Those unknowns drive facilities management folks crazy. We are driven forward in our organizations by assessments, not assertions, and that's all we have right now. We are doers in the FM organizations, and we are people who are frustrated by what appears to be slow decision making. We're problem solvers, and so we are ready to solve problems, but we have to hold. Take for example the conversation around HVAC right now. Facilities managers look at this and say, how can we change the HVAC operations to more safely operate in this situation? When really the first question that needs to be asked and answered is, do we need to change our HVAC operations? And the second question would be, do we want to change the HVAC operations before we start solving the problem of how would we change them? The other thing about it is that we have to pay attention very closely to what I'm calling our employee resiliency banks. One of the biggest withdrawals that we can make from these reserves within our employees is having facilities management professionals start and stop. This is why planning and scheduling is such an important element in our lives, because there is a plan and there is organization. Unfortunately, with this particular crisis, there are many, many starts and stops. And so we have to pay attention that there are frequent withdrawals from our employee resiliency banks, and we need to do what we can to keep those small if that is possible, and try and make some deposits on the other side. So I have on the next slide a graphic which in some ways I find strangely comforting. And I think it's only because I think it explains how I'm feeling right now, where our organizations are at. Around the perimeters of this strange graphic are those decisions that have to be made, new inputs that may come along, and how those decisions have to follow through and across the grid and wind up in one of many, many different kinds of options that would be available in the fall. For example, when you look at the process, the decision-making tree for students learning on campus, that would involve PPE, that would involve transportation, it would involve physical changes to the environment, building systems modifications, and at any point, we wonder if any of these decision points will push us to one of the options on the far right. So when you look at this, it doesn't even really include all of the factors yet that we're dealing with. We know that there are decisions that we're going to make about how to activate campuses again. And we know across the top, there's going to be new information and the virus is going to have a mind of its own, right? It is in control. But there are factors that aren't even reflected here yet that I would even add. There's nothing on this grid about protecting vulnerable populations. There is nothing showing here about the impact of the human capital availability. For example, if we have to divide our classes into smaller sections to accomplish social distancing, do we have the faculty resources to stand up that kind of increased section numbers? Are our employee base going to be stable? Another thing that's not shown here is financial impact. Are there any of these curvy, confusing decision trees going to end up with solutions that are financially not viable? And then finally, there is the impact of culture. How the culture of an institution, how they approach shared governance, those things will have a major impact on what plans will work and what plans will not work in that particular environment. And then finally, the question we're all asking is, even if we do all of this preparation, will students come? That is one of the biggest factors that is out there. Dwayne talked about the the comparison of this crisis to the 9/11 situation, and he talked about an enemy. Well, we all are reminded every day that this enemy seems to be in control right now. There are so many variables being thrown at us at any time. So we come back to those words that we hear a lot these days: uncertainty, unprecedented, unknown. And so when you look at this this webbed grid here of decisions and action points, the inputs around the edge represent decisions and change. Some of them we control, but some of them we don't. But for sure, most of them are interrelated. So for example, if it's determined that we need to use a screening process for one particular population, and part of that screening is temperature taking, we may be increasing the security level by taking that temperature, but we may be decreasing security by closing social distance. We may be using valuable PPE that could be used, maybe should be used, for a more critical use. Everything is interrelated. Every day we learn more. We learn about how this virus survives on surfaces, how it survives in the air, how it's spread, why some populations are more vulnerable than others. We are still looking for the trends and the information. Just think of our perspective about how we contained the spread of this virus. Initially, our focus was on travelers from countries with a high rate of infection. That set a set of actions and assumptions in place. Then our second focus was on protecting the healthy from the sick. Again, a specific set of actions and assumptions were put in place. Now today, we live in a place where our focus has to be on asymptomatic infection, where this is a huge change in our actions and our assumptions that are required for us to combat this disease. A lot of it boils down to this notion of personal responsibility versus protected population. Dwayne talked about creating a protected population in places like airports and air travel, because we can create that protection in a specific danger zone. The world we live in right now doesn't have a specific danger zone. It is a danger zone. So what is the balance of offering personal opportunities for personal responsibility and organizational responsibility to provide a protected environment? So with all that said, what can we do? If then what can we do? So I think there are a couple of things that facilities managers can do right now. I think that the very first and probably most important thing is to take care of our people. This is not a sprint. We're in this for the long haul. And so preserving those resiliency banks of the people around us is going to be critically important. Secondly, I think we can be good partners to our campus and the people making decisions. We can do that by anticipating, learning, listening, and being flexible. We can help figure out what problems need solving, and then of course we can help them solve them. Offering those facts are going to be really important. This is an opportunity for facilities management to show people what we're all about. We know that facilities management, the expertise and what happens here isn't always well known. They don't know what they don't know, and so we can help with that. Another suggestion would be to carefully label the activities that our teams are doing right now in the workplace. Are we planning or are we doing? If we can put some labels and set some expectations, it will help minimize the chaos and the start and stop. But whatever you do, we need to keep planning. And then finally, stay connected. I mentioned at the beginning that I am energized by my connections with people on my team and people across the nation, friends and colleagues that I can rely on for advice. This is how we stay connected to our community, and that community is represented on this call today. So I'm very, very happy to join all of you today. We certainly are all in this together. Thank you.
Lynn, thank you so much. You really gave us so much to think about, helping us understand the complexity of this virus that is in control and how we have to play defense. I really loved your curvy decision trees. It actually demonstrated for me visually the fluidity that is COVID-19. I am reminded of the American Council on Education President's Survey, and they said that their biggest and top concerns were fall enrollment and financial viability. And this tracks right into that. The things that we can do that you've identified are really important in this uncertain, unprecedented, and unknown time. So we really appreciate this, and we will get to questions around these things as well. Let me remind folks that we will provide the recording and all of the slides, so you do not have to worry about that either. So let's go to our third panelist, Mike Johnson, Associate Vice Chancellor for Facilities, University of Arkansas. Mike is a native of Oklahoma and was Rear Admiral in the U.S. Navy Civil Engineer Corps, serving almost 34 years. He was Commander, Naval Facilities Engineering Command, lovingly known as NAVFAC, and Chief of Civil Engineers. Upon his retirement in 2004, he took his position at the University of Arkansas. Mike is a registered PE professional engineer, fellow life member of ASCE and SAME, the Civil Engineers and Society of American Military Engineering. He was inducted into the National Academy of Construction, elected into the National Academy of Engineering, and inducted as an honorary member of the Arkansas Academy of Civil Engineering. Mike received tenure as a professor in the Civil Engineering Department. We have an academic amongst us. Well done, Mike. Mike will address the elements of good planning in these life-threatening, high-risk times that will include assumptions, questions, metrics, triggers, and phases to drive decisions and good communication, the mindset needed, the criticality of being at the table to support and lead, and speak to the University of Arkansas's plan to date, that is, right, Mike? Mike?
Thank you, Lander. Even though you keep trying to put me in Arizona.
I know. My apologies.
I'd like to thank APA and the APA leadership, along with Lander and her staff, for doing these webinars. I've been able to see most of them, and I think it's very helpful. And it's certainly an honor to be on a panel with two people like Dwayne and Lynn. Believe it or not, folks, most of you won't believe it, but we got so energized in our preparatory discussions that Lander couldn't get a word in edgewise. That doesn't happen very often. I'd like to just quickly refresh and reinforce. Dwayne talked about an enemy that's extremely difficult, it's invisible. He talked adaptation, he talked creativity, he talked smart and talented people, but breaking the traditional bounds of thinking. And he left us with no single solution is likely. That's a running theme. Lynn talked about hypothesis and reaching conclusions. Many thises and many wills. Worked through a fishbone diagram, what to do. And my personal favorite, I'll call it the chaos chart, the answer. But again, there's no single answer. Lynn also talked about personal responsibility, and that's all parties on campus. And that's something that I think is going to have to exist from a multidimensional perspective, because if there's one chink in the armor, this disease will go through it. And then it just multiplies, and we can't deal with that. And lastly, maintaining the staff resiliency bank. That really stuck with me because my folks have been working throughout all of this. We've taken them down to about halftime during the week and that type of thing. But our absenteeism has been down, the work ethic has been up, and they're on the front lines. We have to maintain and conserve their energy levels. That leads to me, 2 tough acts to follow, very truly. And what I want to do is kind of have just a little chat, call it a webinar side conversation. There's no slides. And I've been very well set up by my 2 wonderful colleagues who are true professionals and friends in our mutual journey. Sit back a bit, take a deep breath, and let's have a conversation. No, it's going to be a little one-sided. It's going to be me conversing. First, the grand unveiling. There is no silver bullet. And you notice that's been a theme here with all of us. No one size fits all. No one size fits all in one state. No one size fits all in one county like we are. We have a private and we have a public. So now let's move from there. What are we going to do about it? What we do over the next 6 to 12 months will help set the course for higher education for a generation to come. It's going to break cultures. It's going to break how we deliver the academic experience. I do not believe it's going to eliminate the face-to-face aspect, but I think it's going to totally change the multiple methods of delivery and how we do that. It's a risk management versus zero risk. It's an exercise in finding the optimum resting point of the pendulum between those 2 areas. A very risky or an attempt to reach zero risk, which is impossible, all have their own disadvantages. They may be having advantages as well, but they still cause severe impacts on human beings. Doing nothing is not an option. We cannot stay locked down forever. Reopening in phases, I believe, is very smart. The scientific versus the ethical. We'll talk a little bit about that. Significant tragic conflicts between values. Whatever choices involve prioritizing certain kinds of harm over others. And this involves real people. It's not inanimate objects. It's not a window or a door. It's a human being. A lot of people have talked about strategic planning, and I'll talk a little bit about strategic, but what I'm really talking about is tactical and operational planning. Again, there's no correct solutions. There's no wrong plan. Having no plan is absolutely unacceptable. That is not an option. But we do what we do best. Start simple, but start. And then be ready to change, and change frequently, especially in this pandemic. But at the same time, that will drive timely decisions with the decision makers. Lander, Dwayne, Lynn have all talked about unknowns and knowns. The unknowns today probably outnumber the knowns. The unknowns have been talked about: testing, contact tracing, quarantine versus isolation, vaccine or vaccines, exit ramps, face covering, personal protective equipment, mobile apps. All of those are unknowns, and they need to move into the known category.
I don't think
They do that by asking questions, developing metrics, looking at decision points and the triggers that set off those decision points. And as Lynn had mentioned, and I think Dwayne as well, exit ramps. Everything we do needs an exit ramp and some triggers and metrics that lead us down that exit ramp. We've tested an exit ramp over the last 3 months. We can do it. It was probably a little easier than it's going to be finding the on-ramp to get back on the interstate. But we have an exit ramp, and we just need to know the triggers that are going to set that exit ramp off. The overall environment today for us, and I think it's pretty consistent across the country in this one aspect, we're really all in phase 1. And we're trying to transition to phase 2, and we're doing it in a phased approach between 1 and 2. And getting there is going to have its ups and downs. So we need an exit ramp in that process. We get to phase 2. We all want to achieve phase 3. And again, we're going to have an exit ramp on that journey, and we're going to have our ups and downs. And our phase 4, it's aspirations for all of us. And phase 4 is probably going to need an exit ramp, because if it's not this pandemic, it's going to be something else. The critical and essential fact of all this is the facilities management personnel need to be at the table. They need to be at the table to support the strategic planning and the academic mission. But more critically, they're leading by being at the table. Many at this table have never dealt with life-threatening risk management decisions. It's always there, and it has to be driven by data-driven decision points. And we have to mitigate and minimize that life-threatening risk. So what are we doing at the University of Arkansas? We're doing something that appears to be working for us, but it is not the silver bullet. And you can't just take it and dump it down somewhere else. We have a COVID-19 response planning team. Our single focus right now, our option, is Monday, August 24th, 2020, and starting the 2020 fall semester on campus with a hybrid delivery of the academic mission. We have a lead team with subcommittees. Lead subcommittee is the Executive Committee Emergency Preparedness Team. It has a number of mission teams that I call them: the Academic Subcommittee, the Research Subcommittee, Human Resources, Communicable Diseases and Health and Safety. Emergency Preparation, which reaches out into the community, city, county, and state. Events, communications, and athletics. I've put them into a separate group. We also have the Campus Infrastructure Subcommittee. It's a support committee to support the mission committees. It's facilities management across the full spectrum. It's education, health and safety, or environmental health and safety. It's university recreation. It's on-campus housing. It's on-campus dining. It's parking. It's transit. It's Greek life. We have liaisons from other subcommittees in other areas. We have the Office of Equal Opportunity. Vulnerable populations have been mentioned. ADA has to be a consideration in everything we're doing. Human resources, legal, sustainability, athletics. Wrapped around all, both mission and support subcommittees, are communications, financial, and environmental health and safety. There's also some force multipliers: our campus contractors, service contractors, delivery, design, construction, and the community. And the community is the off-campus housing, the off-campus recreation, the off-campus central emergency management systems that respond with ambulances, the Fayetteville Fire Department, the Fayetteville Police Department, backing up the University of Arkansas Police Department. It's the Washington Regional Medical Center, which is our closest major medical facility, that back up the Pat Walker Health Center on campus. It's a very complex and difficult process that we've set up. It requires constant coordination, constant communication, and the initial plans are due in today for a lot of our support groups. It's truly a work in progress. We are planning, though. We're planning with a lot of unknowns, and we're ready to be flexible and agile in making changes to that plan, but we remain focused on August 24th. As we get further into this summer, we'll take that out to December and into the spring semester. So we are planning. And the goal is to take those assumptions and the questions and reduce the uncertainty and the unknowns to more knowns, and to be able to manage them and mitigate them. The critical element is always having an exit ramp and knowing when to use it and when to come back on, which is what we're doing right now from our exit back in March. Again, not having any plan is unacceptable. Realizing plans will change, and normally at first contact with the enemy, they'll change. You have backups, you have options, you're smart people, you're facilities management people. There is no perfect plan. Be at the table. And Lynn mentioned this, but share your plans and absolutely stay connected. We meet once a week online with the SEC senior facility officers, and you wouldn't know we're in the SEC. We're not playing football, we're playing facilities management. We're all playing to win and win as a team. And I will close out the one-sided chat, but and wish you all good luck. Everybody's here to help, so don't hesitate to ask. Lander, back to you.
That's excellent, Mike. I really appreciate it, because we do not have a silver bullet, but the one that we do have and the option that we do have is to make sure that we have a plan and that we are working those plans. Clearly, you helped us understand how important it is to do that, to start simple, but start, and then be prepared to drive that plan or plans with a great deal of flexibility and adaptability. I did like as well the exit ramps that you talked about in terms of what the metrics and data triggers are to make those decisions. It ties nicely to what the other two of you, Dwayne and Lynn, were talking about, using the data to drive your decision making, and that it does require, probably more than ever, this constant coordination, in absolutely constant coordination. So we have a good amount of time. I'm very excited about this, that we can take questions. And so, panel, what I'd like to do is ask all of you, if resurgence during summer, if there is a resurgence during the summer, how quickly will your fall schedule be adjusted? I mean, what are some of the ways you're thinking about your expected ability to respond and change gears? Mike, do you want to take that one, and then I'll go backwards to Lynn?
Yeah, right now we're going to make whatever a final decision might be, probably around the 1 June, the chancellor, working under the president and the system requirements. But I think as we develop the unknowns, we get better testing, better contact tracing. I think that'll modify how quickly we may use an exit ramp. But I would think that we're going to have to make a decision if we see some up checks in some of the metrics that the State Department of Health is using, to pull the trigger in mid to late July before the students start arriving. I think we all found out what it's like to send students home and then bring them back and at some point to unpack or pack. I know of many schools that have used movers to come in and inventory and pack. I know of a couple of schools that are just bringing their kids back now to move out of housing. So I would think we would pull that trigger. We're looking at a potential mid-semester point that we could start if we don't do that in late August, and that's fall break in mid-October, where you could still finish a semester. We're also talking about, if we do get started, can we crunch down the semester and send people home at Thanksgiving and not come back till after New Year's? Then an obvious one would be to start in January and be online and remote the entire fall semester. So a little bit long-winded, but again, there's different exit ramps, and they're going to be driven by different things. But a fall semester, if you possibly can, and think you're going to have to go back to remote and online, it's so much simpler to do it before the students start moving back in, which happens starting right after the 1st of August.
Very good. Lynn, you want to weigh in, or you can pass if you'd like. Up to you.
Yeah, I would just say that Mike's thoughts are fairly consistent. The University of Iowa has a critical incident management team that's working through every scenario, that we are planning to be active and open in the fall. But all of our plans include a couple of other options, some sort of hybrid semester and 100% online. So your question about how fast we could pivot, I think, we're trying to build in as many of those, sorry to go there, but in the if-then statements, so that we can pivot with flexibility. We have students and parents and employees and communities who are really counting on as much information when we can get it to them as quickly as possible.
Excellent. So Dwayne, I would like to go to you on a different question, and that is, we've made some comments about trusting the data when serological tests can be around 85% accurate. I mean, we've had some questions about their efficacy, and then add that there are counterfeit tests which do not have FDA approval and verification. How do we sort of reconcile some of that, or do you think that we are getting better in terms of that testing data and antibody assessments, et cetera?
Sure. Yeah, with this particular disease, it's hard to feel comfortable with an 85% accuracy, given the liability issues, given the social issues that we're dealing with, given the health issues. The 85% is not really comforting when you try to base a lot of decisions on it. However, given the impact of this disease, there's enormous resources working on solutions. Some of those solutions are in the testing, some of those solutions are in the treatment, some of those solutions are looking for vaccine. Some of those solutions are not just in the testing, but also in the tracking. And being able to find out what's working, what's not working, I think is going to be very important. And this is an area that seems to be moving very, very quickly. So here we are in early May. We're looking for solutions that are going to help us open our institutions in August and September and do it safely. Going to the testing, there's several factors about the testing that an institution has to deal with. One is the accuracy, as we've been talking about. A second is the expense of the test. In one discussion I had with an institution, we were talking about the expense and populations wanting to travel on and off campus and how often could we test. And we had a discussion, well, maybe when a student comes onto campus in the fall and they're tested and they're cleared to be on campus, we recognize, okay, you're going to get 2 more tests or 3 more tests during the semester. If you go home and you leave the campus and you come back, you have to be tested before you get back into the campus. And if you use up more than your allotted number of tests, then you're going to be obligated to pay for one or quarantine before you get back into the population. If there is a resurgence, you know, these sorts of what feel like right now draconian measures may feel more appropriate to us at that moment. That goes to Lynn's diagram, which I think is absolutely brilliant in its description of where we are. Once we get snarled up in some of those things, some of the social adjustments that we may have to make will become normal until other solutions come up. So it's not comforting to have an 85%. We're going to need, I think, a much higher accuracy rate. We're going to need it in a reasonable expense, and we're going to need it in a reasonable time frame. Doing, I think Bill Gates has pointed out, doing testing that you don't get the results of 4 days until 4 days later is not a very helpful test. We need a test that's going to give us a result, an accurate result, in a very reasonable amount of time, and hopefully at a manageable cost.
Excellent. So Mike, I have a couple for you here that I think are probably quick ones, but do you foresee using the off-ramps and on-ramps in the same semester?
Never say no. I think that's part of the unknowns here. I mean, I could see going on an off-ramp and a vaccine coming out or something like that has fairly quick take-up. So that would be very difficult because of the turmoil that it would create with the students and the learning elements of the academic mission. I'd say likely not, but everything is doable, but there's a cost both in people and a cost financially.
Excellent, thank you. At offline, Mike, could you provide some examples of your plans? Some folks are asking about possibly being able to get a few of the details around how you're handling classrooms, housing, some other spaces. If and when you're allowed to share those, we would love to have those documents also to share. And I understand, you know, if you cannot, but that's something that folks are asking for. Okay, so you can think about that, right?
We'd be happy to do that. They're morphing right now. There's some good ones floating around now from other places. Connecticut just came out with a state plan that has some very nice details in it that's online, and LSU is working on some reopening plans that I've just seen in the last day. But absolutely, you know, it's part of what we do in facilities management is help everyone else, and we can all use it as a pole vault ahead.
That's excellent, Mike, and I know all of you will. My first Monday morning message on COVID ended with "We care and we share." That is what is so amazing about this community. Why I got hooked into it when I was at the University of Maryland, College Park, and now 25 years later at APA. So thank you, Lynn. Could I take you to a different question? Some folks were asking, how are you addressing the mental health ramifications of social physical distancing and the other limitations around COVID, which they described as could be possibly as detrimental as COVID-19. Maybe you could sort of chime in on that one. I think it's a really, really important piece of this.
Yes, Lander, it certainly is. The University of Iowa has a really deep bench when it comes to supporting students, staff, faculty, and their families. And so there's been a very aggressive approach to this, a lot of specific resources, and a lot of pretty frank talk about how this can impact us. There have been a lot of conversations about the likening it to PTSD. There's been so much fear and fear management and unknown. You know, we're dealing with the unknowns, not just at work. It's our families, it's our community, it's our world. So yeah, we've been very, very fortunate. We've got a great system built there, and I think there's going to be a blossom of all kinds of resources, because this can definitely take a toll on us.
That's excellent, Lynn. And as you said that, it also reminded me of the one that we did on human resources, Arizona and Indiana, and then we had Coupa HR's, my counterpart there, Andy Brantley, and they have an enormous number of information on their site as well, tapping into telehealth, mental health side, and really just desperately trying to get people to utilize those resources, because it is a time, I mentioned before, no muscle memory. We don't know what we don't know, and it's very difficult on people's psyche. So let me ask, I'm going to go to Dwayne on this one. We have a question around the tensions between medical data and political and financial and economic data. What data are we recommending as helpful in these decision making? And Mike, you used it, the word triggers. Dwayne, could you take a little stab at that? Because I know you are heavily involved in the whole data management side of things and looking at that. Could you take a stab?
Sure. Boy, this is a question fraught with a lot of pitfalls. You know, this is, as I pointed out, this is a crisis. It started out as a health crisis. It took a while for us to recognize, you know, that it was really a significant health crisis because it was so slow and creeping. And then it's become a financial crisis, and it's a major liability crisis as we try to work these plans. What plans leave us the least or the most manageable risk? And yes, and I avoided the whole political crisis. We can certainly suggest it's that as well. So when working with data, there's no one data set that will give you the right answer. If there is a data set that gives you the right answer, it's not a very complex problem. When we're dealing with complex problems, there are multiple data sets that we need to look at, and we have to triangulate between these data sets. I frequently use the metaphor: if you look at a piece of paper, from holding it up in front of your face, it looks like an opaque wall. If you look at it flat, looking at it, it looks like a wire. So no one perspective is 100% accurate. So an organization, an institution needs to look at what is their risk tolerance in terms of health, in terms of finance, in terms of other risks like liability and you know, ongoing business, that sort of thing. I don't know of any institution that would be able to take a gap year, you know, that shut down for a year and say, well, we'll come back when there's a vaccine. That's not a. So we've got to get the best available data that we can, triangulate it to manage the risks that are most tolerable for us, and then make the best decisions that we can recognizing that we're constantly gathering more data and we have to be flexible in our plans as we go forward and change quickly. Because
Excellent.
as Mike pointed out, no plan survives first contact with the enemy.
That's terrific. Just as I thought you would handle, really wonderful. We have several questions. I'll go first with Lynn and then to Mike, and that's about the portion of online courses that are synchronous versus asynchronous. But then I want to map this to how you are considering blended learning with respect to post-COVID at our institutions. I heard you say, Mike, hybrid, and I think, Lynn, that is an anticipated move by most institutions, but maybe you two could just pop in on that. Lynn, do you want to go first?
Sure, Lander. You know, I think there are all sorts of options that the smart creative people are thinking about, but recently we were talking about making sure that we had a wide enough lens. So all of the what if situations. So the opportunity to be on campus and everything that comes with that, setting up the physical environment for that, not just synchronous and asynchronous, but also recording and archive. Because there may be situations where a student is definitely engaged, but will need to get caught up because of some circumstance. And so that's one of those things, is really broadening that platform so that there are multiple options depending on what happens. I know the University of Iowa, similar to a lot of institutions, are looking at the possibility of having some of the very large sections be online, and many of those are offered that way anyway. So yeah, definitely hybrid, blending, and alternatives are all being considered.
Excellent. Okay, Mike, do you want to add to that? Because I know you did mention it.
Yeah, similar to what Lynn's talking about in many degrees. The latest version that I heard just in the past week, people quickly realized we were, back up a second, we were pretty heavily utilizing, we've been on central scheduling since 2010, 2011. We've been heavily utilizing both seats and available slots for the rooms. We're probably in the 65% net, which is pretty high. At one point in 2012 or 13, we actually got up above 80 net because we had some buildings offline, and that was too much. But they've quickly found out that physical distancing goes down to 25, 30, 35% if you're lucky. And you get into the big auditoriums, even more so. So they're looking at a blend where, for instance, and I'm not on that academic committee, they know better than that, but you'll go to a Monday, Wednesday class, maybe Monday, Wednesday, Friday class, maybe you go one day a week. The other 2 days, it's going to be online. Normally they upload to 360 within minutes, if not simultaneously from the presentation. And you would do 2 of those classes that week online, and then you would do 1 class in person. They're looking at extended hours. We have a very full day, like right now, from 7:30 to 5:20. They're looking at the 5:30 to, I think, as late as 10, getting extensive use as well. They're also talking Saturdays to pick up on specialty type things. I'm concerned that the accommodations requirements has been growing significantly over the last few years for special testing, for one-on-one, more testing time, and they've been bursting at the seams. I see that as being a difficult time if we reduce the face-to-face and then have people trying to deal with it online. We'll need more of that as well. So it's going to be a learning experience, working through all of that. How do you do the fees? How do you do other things? It's TBD as we work through it this summer.
Very good. Very good. There are a couple of questions that I think I can field for folks. You asked about PPP loans. The Payroll Protection Program loans are not available for the higher education or educational institutions. There are different sources through the Fed's Department of Treasury, and then the Department of Education is on a formula basis from that first outgo of resources. And so those are available on the American Council on Education site and through the Fed's Department of Treasury site. You can send me a question if you have it that I can probably point you in the right direction. The second one was around thoughts on institutional resource investments on the back end, and shouldn't we place greater emphasis on governmental intervention on the front end? And then there was the follow-on to that of isn't it a blend of both? And actually it is. There will naturally be a blend, but absent of that on the government side, the institutions, many of them are taking it on in order to protect their communities. So I think there is a lot of parallel activity. The question around herd immunity is an ongoing debate since we know the vaccine will be not in the near term. So I would recommend that you do some more research on herd immunity and what it does or does not offer at the moment because of what we don't know about this particular novel coronavirus. I did have a different question for this team, and all of you, if you could, is how might you consider the thought of a net zero square footage? I'm looking at what are the pros, the opportunities of that possibility, maybe what are the negatives or obstacles. It gets you into a sea of responses, and I'll limit you to about 4 minutes or so as we go to close. But Lynn, might you want to chime in on that?
Tell me more about the background of the question, the net zero.
Yes, and this is around reducing, eliminating square footage, maybe in demolitions, just reducing your entire footprint in order to bring overall fixed costs down. That's the question we're getting.
Very good. I thought that's what you meant, but I just wanted to make sure. I think this is one of those traditions probably that Dwayne talked about, is that we traditional higher education had to really fight for every additional square foot, and it's really difficult to think about not having that square feet available to us, maybe regardless of the condition. And plus there is also the emotional ties to buildings representing what campus is all about. Yeah, it's a good thing you did limit us, because we could have a really long conversation about the long-term investment that you need to make to those kinds of resources. I think that,
go ahead,
yeah,
continue,
I think one of the silver linings, or one of the learning opportunities that we have with this COVID situation, is how many of our campus functions are working in a remote situation. And keep in mind that remote situation is driven by a fear and urgency with little planning, and probably difficult home situations as well. So I think that if we lean into that and use this experience to learn about what worked, what didn't, it could make this significant change in thinking about how we use space on a campus, how we operate on campus. It could really spring us forward in progress to this notion of being very, very strategic and deliberate about the kinds of spaces we invest in on our campuses.
That's great. And so I'll ask Mike just whether your institution is delaying new capital construction projects as a result of COVID.
No, not necessarily. For the last 10 years, we've grown about 70% in student body and faculty and staff, going up with that. Our goal has always been to build only what we need. We have also invested a tremendous amount in renovating what we've had so that we use it more, modernizing classrooms, and dumb rooms are now smart rooms. So that's why our utilization has stayed up so much. That's why our central scheduling saved our bacon as we were growing significantly in the mid-2010s. We're in a pretty good place. I think Lynn has some great points, and I think administratively we might be able to look at reducing requirements and/or demolition. We have done a little selected demolition, but we have only built it when we need it, and literally just in time. We've actually had people overflowing into swing space, and we were doing labs on Sunday afternoon for a year or two in that 10-year spread. So it's a good thought. I think there's opportunities. I think there's opportunities in the online world to do things differently. Maybe alternate semesters when they live in residence and that type of thing.
Very good. That's excellent. Just what I was looking for, and it's really, really important that we think that way. Are any of you, and Dwayne, think about this, how are you characterizing the faculty's view or perspective on a fall reopening? Because that's been one of those if then whats. Dwayne, you want to touch that just a little bit from the discussion we had earlier this week with the panel?
Sure. Yeah, there's the student perspective and the faculty's perspective, and obviously making sure that we do everything that we can to make sure that that's a comfortable interaction is going to be important. A certain amount of that interaction may be able to be online. Large lecture halls, I think Mike talked about that. Some of those large lecture halls, lecture courses might lend themselves well to online. But then how do we make sure that faculty and students are comfortable in doing their interaction on campus? That is, again, it comes back to testing, it comes back to data, it comes back to are we able to have a protected population in a protected space that we've looked at. Some institutions may find that this is easier to do than others. If a commuter school, it may be very difficult to establish close interaction between faculty and students. There may have to be a barrier. I've tried to imagine what education would feel like if it's controlled the same way that we go into a grocery store right now with the sneeze guards on steroids around the checkout clerks. Yeah, this is going to be, again, not one size fits all. It's going to have to be managed by the institution to make it comfortable.
Okay, that's excellent. So I'm going to go to close. We appreciate all the questions. Those that we did not get to, we will go research for you. And so we will do some work on that. And so, you know, the space survey, which closed this past Monday, drew close to 500 participants and has been posted to COVID-19 related surveys and responses. Really got a nice update on the infographic, a cogent summary, and on a beautiful layout of your detailed responses. We're always looking on a call for images for COVID-19. We're already utilizing them on the website. We appreciate the contributions to date. We have a slide on the resources that are available to all of you and a save the date next week's topic, preparing now for the student of 2024. My closing remarks are, as I open up the panelist remarks, I said, hope is not a strategy. However, in the context of human needs, it's a whole different story. My longtime friend, colleague, and mentor, Doug Christensen, 40 years at Brigham Young University, was dubbed as a man of many firsts. This time of unprecedented, unsettling uncertainty is full of many firsts. Gallup's global research team revealed 4 universal needs that leaders should heed. The first is hope, the excitement about a better future. Trust, the belief that words will connect with actions. Compassion, an understanding of others, of how they feel, what is on their mind, knowing you are listening. And stability. Employees want to know some things will be consistent even in times of immense challenge and change. In all that you do, take care and concern to speak to each of these needs. We all need hope, trust, compassion, and stability now more than ever. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend. See you next Friday.
Landry,